William Shakespeare. You obviously recognize that name. Most people, if not everyone, have heard of the name William Shakespeare at least once in their lifetime. Most of the basic information that people know about Shakespeare is that he is just another poet and playwright. He's someone of the past, but in comparison to other historic people, very little is known about William Shakespeare. That brings up some questions. What was his writing style? What kind of family was he raised in? What kind of person was a little Shakespeare like? Why and how is he famous? Why is he important to literature? How has he contributed to society? What's so interesting about him? Well, before we journey into his life, you probably have to know a little bit about how the society was working during his time.
Shakespeare's life takes place in England during the Elizabethan era, where the people's life revolved around a social order which consisted first of the monarch, in which Queen Elizabeth I reigned, the nobility, which consisted of the lords and ladies of the land, the gentry, of whom were the knights, squires, gentlemen, and gentlewomen, the merchants, the yeomanry, who were tradesmen and craft workers, and finally, the laborers. Now, notice the clothing? Parliament made a type of clothing system ensuring that the class structure was maintained and made it easier to help classify the ranks people were in. Like I said, they were really into rankings.
That's right.
At this time, thanks to Queen Elizabeth's rule, England became the top commercial power of the Western Hemisphere. Many things flourished and prospered, including miniature portraits, architecture, and the iron industry. Oxford and Cambridge were popular universities in England, probably because they were the only universities in England.
Although England improved a lot, not everything was perfect. Most people still lived in poverty, which created more robbery and violence. The punishment in England were very severe. I mean, executions by beheading were considered the least brutal of execution methods. So imagine what the most brutal execution method actually is. Because the Elizabeth era was revolved around the social order, people at the top had little respect for the lower class. I guess you can say that each class looked highly of themselves in comparison to the class or classes below them. The rich also had advantages in the court, with bribery. Considering that this was common, it justifies that there was a lot of corruption during that period in England.
Well, in this town called Stratford-upon-Avon, which is somewhere around here, Shakespeare was born in 1564. His father, John Shakespeare, was a famous merchant in the yeomanry class. He was also elected chamberlain, alderman, and mayor in Stratford, but was later accused of usury for lending money at the rate of 20% and 25% interest. He married Mary Arden, a daughter of a wealthy family. Of course, they only got married after her father died, since he didn't approve of her marrying a lower class. Sad, right? Together they had 8 children. Joan, their first child, Margaret, William, Gilbert, another daughter also named Joan, Anne, Richard, and finally Edmund. Unfortunately, Joan, the first child, Margaret, and Anne didn't survive their childhood, apparently due to the bubonic plague. Shakespeare's family was all illiterate. Surprised much? But Shakespeare did get an education. Because his father had financial problems, he was later withdrawn from his school at the age of 14, which is amazing since he achieved so much afterwards.
There are no records of where Shakespeare was educated. There is also little information about what happened to Shakespeare after he left school, which is known as the lost years. What was known was that Shakespeare, who was around 17 years old, married a 25-year-old Anne Hathaway in 1582. Their first child, Susanna, was conceived before they were married and was born in 1583. Obviously, during these times, it was a major scandal to get pregnant before marriage. He also had twins named Hamnet and Judith. He moved to London by 1592. No one knows why he moved to London, but during the Elizabeth era, London was the center of trade in Europe. It was the largest city in England, consisting of 200,000 people. Of course, that was a big number in those times. In London, he worked as an actor. During that time, actors were treated with suspicion since they were consisted of rugs and vagabonds. They weren't trusted. Plays were shown in theaters that were also used as beer pit, brothel, and gambling house.
It is said that one of the plays that Shakespeare wrote were parts 1, 2, and 3 of Henry VI. At the beginning of his playwright career, he received many criticisms and was looked down upon since playwrights were not seen as literary experts. Being a playwright during those times were dangerous. If a playwright expressed profane or rebellious opinions in opposition to state, he would be tortured and sentenced to death for treason. This was probably why Shakespeare never claimed authorship or publication of any of his plays. Shakespeare has written many famous works that some of you might have heard of, such as Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer's Night Dream, and Macbeth. But Shakespeare is also known for his famous works Othello and The Tempest. William Shakespeare's early works focused on comedies and histories, such as Romeo and Juliet, written in 1597, and then he later focused primarily on tragedies including Othello, Hamlet, Macbeth, and King Lear. Othello was written in the year 1604, and it is one of William Shakespeare's greatest tragedy-themed plays. Macbeth was written later in 1611, while Hamlet, on the other hand, was a much earlier work written 1599. Towards his final years as a poet, William Shakespeare focused his works on romance and tragicomedy. That included another 3 major plays: Cymbeline, The Winter's Tale, and The Tempest. The Tempest was written around the year of 1623, along the publication of The Winter's Tale. These plays are much graver in tone than his previous comedies. Shakespeare is often called England's national poet and even the Bard of Avon. In his poems and plays, he used a metrical pattern consisting of lines of unrhymed iambic pentameter called blank verse. Shakespeare also used on average 70% blank verse, 5% rhymed verse, and 25% prose. He also used prose for several reasons to demonstrate a familiar relationship, a character status, and when the rational is contrasted with the emotional. William Shakespeare, unfortunately, died in 1616.
Shakespeare isn't relevant anymore, right? Wrong.
Shame on you.
If you didn't already know, he used a lot of made-up words and phrases in his works. Some examples that are believed to have been made up by Shakespeare are the words eyeball, puking, obscene, and hot-blooded, believe it or not. Because of this, he helped expand the scope of English. He also introduced new concepts and grammatical structures. He has contributed a lot to modern society. In our present day, however, there is a Shakespeare authorship controversy floating around. It's a mystery and question of whether William Shakespeare actually wrote the works that was said to be written by him. Some say that Shakespeare's name was used to hide the identity of the real author. Many candidates of the authorship came up, including Sir Francis Bacon, Christopher Marlowe, and Edward de Vere, in which he was considered in the movie Anonymous.
Well, which is it?
Is Shakespeare the real author, or is he just a fraud?
Well, let's leave that up to the audience to decide, because it will probably remain a mystery forever.
And ever.
And ever. And ever.
The end. Thank you for listening and not sleeping.